The mud was cold and thick, the kind that swallowed boot heels and held them like a secret it refused to give up. And yet Kade Merritt, the man who had never bent his knee to any living soul, not to bankers, not to rival ranchers, not even to the drought that had scorched 3 consecutive summers from his land, was on both knees in that mud. His hat was in his hands. Rain hammered the brim of it, ran down his fingers, soaked through his denims and into the skin beneath. The Laramie station platform was crowded with travelers who had the good sense to look away, because there are things a person witnesses in this life that feel too private to watch, even for strangers. She was already on the steps of the train car. Her carpetbag was in her hand. Her dark hair was pressed down under the weight of the rain, and her jaw was set with that particular kind of resolve that Kade had come to recognize over the past 8 months. The kind that meant she had made up her mind and was terrified she might change it if she stood there a moment longer. "Josephine," he said, and it did not sound like his voice. It sounded like something had been torn open in the center of his chest and was speaking through the wound. "Do not get on that train." She looked down at him. She looked at this tall, broad-shouldered man who had ridden across 3 counties without stopping, whose horse stood at the fence post still heaving, who was kneeling in the mud in front of God and the Wyoming territory and everyone assembled on the platform. And her eyes filled with something that was not quite grief and not quite love and was probably both at the same time. "You told me I was nothing to you," she said quietly. "You said it in front of your foreman and your men. You said it so they would all hear." "I know what I said. You said I was a distraction. You said I was a hired woman doing a hired woman's job, and that I should not confuse professional courtesy for sentiment." The rain filled the silence between those words and his reply. "I lied," Kade Merritt said. "I lied through every tooth in my head, and I am kneeling in the mud in front of half of Laramie to tell you so. Please do not get on that train." She stood on that step for 3 full seconds. The train whistle shrieked above them both. And the entire story of how a proud man came to ruin himself in the most public way possible began 7 months and 14 days before that moment, on a Tuesday in October of 1882, when a woman with a carpetbag and a forged letter of reference arrived at the gate of the Merritt Ranch looking for work. The autumn of 1882 had not been kind to Wyoming. The grasslands were recovering slowly from the summer's heat, and the cattle market had softened in a way that made experienced ranchers nervous and inexperienced ones desperate. Kade Merritt was neither. He was 29 years old. He had inherited the ranch from a father who had built it with deliberate hands and a ruthless eye for land. And he had expanded it in the 6 years since his father's death with the same combination of shrewdness and stubbornness that people in Albany County alternately admired and resented. He was not a cruel man. That is important to establish early because the story might suggest otherwise in its darker passages. He was a contained man, which is a different thing entirely. He had grown up watching his father express affection primarily through the assignment of responsibility, and he had learned the lesson well. He ran the ranch. He managed 42 head of cattle, 12 horses, 7 full-time ranch hands, and a property that stretched nearly 4,000 acres along the eastern flank of the Laramie Mountains. He did all of this with very little visible emotion, which his ranch hands interpreted as strength, and which Kade privately understood to be armor. His housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Gorman, had left in September to care for an ailing sister in Colorado. He needed someone to manage the house, to cook for the crew, to maintain the records of supply purchases, and to assist with the correspondence that piled up whenever he was occupied in the field. He had placed a notice in the Laramie newspaper and received 4 responses. 3 of them were unsuitable for reasons ranging from age to temperament to a complete inability to write legible sentences. The 4th arrived in person, before he had a chance to respond to her letter. Josephine Zahra arrived on a Tuesday morning with a carpetbag over one shoulder and a letter of reference folded in the breast pocket of her coat. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she had dark eyes that processed everything in a room within approximately 3 seconds of entering it. She stood at the gate and asked for Mr. Merritt in a voice that was direct without being aggressive. And when the ranch hand Clem went to fetch him, she waited without fidgeting, watching the horses in the near pasture with the particular attention of someone who understood horses. Kade read the reference letter. It was from a household in Cheyenne, attesting to Miss Zahra's organizational abilities, her competence in household management, her literacy and bookkeeping skills, and her general reliability of character. It was a good letter, professionally composed, and it was almost entirely fabricated. He did not know that yet. "You have experience managing a working ranch household?" he asked. "I have experience managing a household under difficult circumstances," she said, which was technically true. "This is a working ranch. The men eat twice a day and the supply list changes weekly. The correspondence has backed up because I have been short-handed. Can you manage books? I can manage books. Can you cook for 8 men? I can cook for 8 men. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him with a steadiness that most people in Kade's experience could not maintain under direct scrutiny. "You are from where originally?" he asked. "Colorado," she said. "Most recently Cheyenne." He offered her the position that morning. The pay was $12 a month plus room and board. She accepted it without negotiation, which he interpreted as gratitude and she interpreted as survival. What Josephine Zahra did not tell Kade Merritt on that Tuesday morning, or on any of the subsequent days for some time after, was that the reference letter from Cheyenne had been written by her own hand in a borrowed sitting room after the woman who had originally agreed to write it had changed her mind. She did not tell him that she had left Cheyenne under circumstances that could most charitably be described as complicated and most accurately described as desperate. She did not tell him about Lawrence Holt, who was the source of those complications and the architect of that desperation. She told herself she would only stay long enough to put some distance between herself and Holt, and perhaps to save enough money to get further west. She told herself the lie would expire naturally when she moved on. She had not counted on the ranch being what it was. She had not counted on the work being real and grounding in a way that her life had not felt in over 2 years. She had not counted on finding something at the Merritt Ranch that felt, against all reason, like the beginning of something rather than the end. The first weeks were businesslike. Kade was away from the house for most of each day, managing the autumn roundup preparations and overseeing the movement of cattle to the winter pastures. Josephine learned the house, learned the rhythms of the ranch, learned the names and preferences of the hands. She got the supply records in order within the first week, which earned her a look of surprised approval from Kade when he reviewed them and said simply, "Good. That is better than I expected." She recognized that as high praise from a man of his particular economy. The cook situation proved unexpectedly central to her integration with the crew. Ranch hands in Wyoming in 1882 cared about very few things with more consistency than they cared about food, and Josephine discovered early on that she had a gift for it. Not fine cooking, but the kind of substantial, well-seasoned, reliably good cooking that a man who has been working since before dawn genuinely needs. The crew warmed to her within 2 weeks, which meant they treated her with a combination of protectiveness and teasing that she found, to her own surprise, rather comforting. Clem, the oldest of the hands at 44, adopted a sort of avuncular posture toward her and occasionally left firewood near the kitchen door without being asked. A younger hand named Pete was transparently smitten with her for approximately 3 weeks before she made it gently clear that his attentions were not welcome in that direction, after which he became her most reliable assistant in heavy lifting tasks, which she understood as his way of redirecting his admiration into something useful. Foreman Walt Briggs was professionally courteous and personally reserved, and she respected that. Kade himself was the last piece of the puzzle. He was not unfriendly. He was present in the house at breakfast, at supper if he was not working late, and sometimes in the evenings when he sat at the desk in the front room reviewing correspondence and ranch accounts. He acknowledged her work with brief, accurate assessments. He ate what she cooked without complaint, and occasionally, with what she suspected was genuine appreciation, though he expressed this primarily by clearing his plate completely, which she decided to count. He was also, she noticed, exhaustingly competent at nearly everything he turned his hand to, in the way of men who have been forced to be self-reliant from a young age and have never quite learned how to put down the burden of it. She watched him once in the second-week repair, a fence section that 2 hands had been struggling with for the better part of an afternoon, doing it in 30 minutes with a methodical patience that suggested he found the mechanical problem genuinely interesting. She watched him negotiate with a cattle buyer who arrived unannounced one morning, and saw in his eyes a sharpness and a pleasure in the negotiation that he otherwise kept completely concealed. She found him interesting. She told herself that was all it was. In November, the first real snow came, and the ranch closed in on itself the way ranches do in Wyoming winters, with a kind of forced intimacy imposed by weather and necessity. The hands lived in the bunkhouse, but mealtimes became longer. The evenings in the main house stretched out with the cold outside pressing against the windows, and Kade began staying at the desk later and later into the evenings, not always working, sometimes just reading, sometimes sitting with a cup of coffee and the kind of silence that has a quality of rest to it rather than emptiness. It was in one of those November evenings that they had their first real conversation. She had come through the front room to bank the stove before bed and found him sitting not at the desk but in the armchair near the window, a book open in his lap and the lamp turned low. He was not reading. He was looking at the dark window, which showed nothing but the reflection of the room. "Is there anything you need before I turn in?" she asked. He looked at her, and something in his expression was different from the way he looked at her during the functional hours of the day. It was more direct and less managed. "Sit down for a minute," he said, not as an order, more as something he surprised himself by saying. She sat in the chair across from him. The stove ticked quietly. "What made you leave Colorado?" he asked. She had a practiced answer for this question. She had used it twice already on the ranch, once with Clem and once with Pete, and it was smooth and plausible and covered enough of the truth to be defensible without being honest. She opened her mouth to give it and then, for reasons she could not immediately explain, said something closer to the real thing. "I needed to start over," she said. "I had made decisions that I thought were right, and they turned out to be catastrophically wrong, and the only way forward was to put distance between myself and the consequences." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of decisions?" "The kind that involved trusting someone who turned out not to be trustworthy." He nodded slowly, and she had the sense that this particular category of mistake was not foreign to him. "You do not have to tell me more than that," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because he had offered her that exit and she found she did not entirely want to take it. She said, "His name was Lawrence Holt. He was a businessman in Denver. He convinced me to leave my position with a family there and come to Cheyenne with him, where he had investments he was managing. He told me we would be married. I believed him for much longer than I should have because I needed to believe it and because he was very good at lying." Kade said nothing. He was watching her with an attention that was not prying but was very complete. "He had debts," she said, "serious ones. He had been using money that was not his to use, including money that people believed was being managed on their behalf. When his creditors came, and they came with the particular urgency of men who have been defrauded, he was very quick to suggest that I had been involved in the management of the accounts." She paused. "I had not been. I had believed I was doing legitimate secretarial work." "You left before it could be formally attached to you," Kade said. "I left before it could be formally attached to me," she confirmed. "Which means I left everything behind, my savings, my reputation in Cheyenne, my references." She looked at him steadily. "The letter I gave you when I applied was not written by the person whose name is on it." There was a long silence. She had not intended to tell him that. She still was not entirely sure why she had. Something about the firelit room and the quality of his listening had pulled it out of her before she could apply the usual controls. "You wrote it yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." He looked at the dark window again. She waited. "Can you actually do the things it says you can do?" he asked. "Yes." "Then we will not discuss it further," he said, and picked up his book. She stared at him for a moment. "That is your entire response?" "The work you have done here in the past month is more evidence of your capability than any letter," he said, without looking up from the page. "I am more interested in what is true than in what is formal." She stood up slowly and went to bank the stove, and she was halfway to the kitchen when he said, without raising his voice or altering his tone, "I am sorry about what he did to you." She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, not turning around. "Thank you," she said. She lay awake for a long time that night, looking at the ceiling of her room off the kitchen, listening to the wind work at the eaves, and acknowledged to herself that the situation was becoming complicated in ways she had not anticipated. December arrived with a severity that the old-timers in Laramie said was one of the harder ones in recent memory. The ranch was effectively cut off from town for stretches of days at a time when the pass road iced over, and the wind came down from the mountains with an intent that felt personal. Josephine and Kade spent those days in a proximity enforced by circumstance, and what began as a matter of practical necessity developed into something that neither of them named, but both of them felt. She learned his habits. The way he drank his coffee, black and very strong, and held the cup with both hands in the morning as though he was drawing something from it beyond warmth. The way he hummed very quietly and tunelessly to himself when he was doing mechanical work, completely unconscious of it. The way he read, which was voraciously and with a retention that she tested once by asking about a passage from a book he had finished 2 weeks earlier, and he quoted it back to her nearly verbatim. He learned hers. She had a habit of reorganizing things when she was anxious, a sort of controlled restlessness that expressed itself in straightening what was already straight. She talked to the horses when she went to the barn. She had strong opinions about the correct way to prepare cornbread that she defended with a passion disproportionate to the subject matter, which he found, though he would not have admitted it at the time, absolutely charming. He started bringing things back from the barn for her. Not gifts exactly, because he would not have known how to characterize them as such, but useful things that he had thought of while he was out there. A better milk pail after he noticed the old one had developed a slow drip. A bag of dried herbs from town that he happened to pass during a quick trip in when the road was briefly passable, because he had heard her mention once that the kitchen supply was running low. She started leaving the lamp on later in the evenings, because she knew he came in late from checking on the livestock, and the kitchen was cold in the dark. These were not confessions. They were not declarations. They were the small daily languages of two people who were falling in love without the structural permission to acknowledge it, and who were therefore doing it entirely in code. The crisis arrived in January, the way crises in the Wild West frequently did, without announcement and from an unexpected direction. His name was Darnell Voss, and he arrived at the Merritt Ranch on a Thursday morning in the third week of January 1883, riding a gray horse and carrying the particular kind of confidence that comes from believing one holds a significant advantage over the person one is about to visit. He was 40 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the deeply tanned and creased face of a man who had spent decades outdoors in hard country. He was also, Kade would learn within the first 5 minutes of conversation, the owner of the Voss Cattle Company, whose eastern boundary ran adjacent to the Merritt Ranch's northern fence line, and who had recently purchased a controlling interest in the water rights to a creek that ran through both properties. Kade received him on the porch. Josephine, who was inside with the door partially open for the ventilation of a hot stove, could hear the conversation. "I want to discuss an arrangement," Voss said, in a tone that suggested the discussion was a formality preceding a conclusion he had already reached. "An arrangement regarding what?" Kade said. "The creek access. My attorneys have been reviewing the deed filings, and the rights I purchased encompass a section that your eastern cattle currently depend on during the winter months. Those cattle have used that creek for the 14 years since my father filed the original claim," Kade said. "That may be so. The legal instrument I now hold takes precedence over historical usage." Josephine heard the particular quality of silence that came from Kade when he was genuinely angry and holding it down very deliberately. "What is the arrangement you are proposing?" he said. "I am willing to grant your cattle continued access to the creek in exchange for a deeding of the 300 acres on your northern boundary to the Voss Company at a valuation I have had assessed." "Your assessed valuation, you mean?" "A professional assessment," Voss said. "You are welcome to review it." "I will review it," Kade said, "and I will have my own attorney review the water rights instrument you are describing, because I am not familiar with any sale of those rights that my father or I were not party to." Voss smiled. She could hear it in his voice. "Of course, I would expect nothing less. I will return in 2 weeks for your decision." He paused. "I hope you will see the practical wisdom in accepting the arrangement, Merritt. The alternative for your cattle in the dead of winter is not comfortable." After Voss rode away, Kade came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. Josephine kept her attention on the stove. "You heard that," he said. "Yes. He is trying to pressure me into selling land that has been in my family for 14 years by threatening the water access that my herd depends on in winter." "Yes," she said. "He is." "What would you do?" he asked. It was not an idle question. He was genuinely asking. She turned from the stove and thought about it seriously. "I would have your attorney look at the water rights instrument immediately, because if there is a flaw in the chain of title, that is your strongest position. In the meantime, I would begin identifying the alternative water sources on your property and calculating whether you can sustain the herd through winter without the creek, because if you can, his leverage disappears. And I would not give him an answer in 2 weeks. I would let him wait." Kade looked at her for a long moment. "That is exactly right," he said. She noticed that he did not seem surprised that she had analyzed it correctly. He seemed rather satisfied, as though he had known she would and had asked partly to confirm it. The next 2 weeks were a crucible. Kade sent an urgent letter to his attorney in Laramie, a methodical man named Elias Forster, who did not move quickly under normal circumstances, but who recognized urgency when he saw it. He began the work of mapping the alternative water sources on his property, which proved viable but challenging in the January cold. And Josephine, in the evenings, helped him go through the ranch records and the original deed filings that his father had kept in a locked chest in the study. It was during those evenings, bent over the desk together with the lamp between them and the ranch documents spread out in front of them, that the line between professional collaboration and something far more personal became impossible to locate. Their shoulders were an inch apart over the desk. She reached past him to point to a line in a filing, and her hand brushed his arm, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them acknowledged it, and the air in the room changed quality in a way that was unmistakable. On the 14th night, after they had found what appeared to be a significant irregularity in the recorded transfer of the water rights, an irregularity that Elias Forster subsequently confirmed gave strong grounds for a legal challenge, she looked up from the document and found him already watching her. "We found it," she said. "You found it," he corrected. "I had gone over those pages 3 times. You were looking for a different kind of problem. You were thinking like a rancher. I was thinking like someone who has seen a dishonest man construct paperwork before." There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before. It was not the usual managed competence or the occasional frustrated intensity of the Voss problem. It was something quieter and more defenseless. "Josephine," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am going to say something, and I need you to tell me honestly if I am misreading the situation." "Say it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him make a decision the way she had seen him make operational decisions on the ranch, with a kind of deliberate, committed finality. "I have not been this comfortable with a person in my adult life," he said. "I find myself thinking about what you will say about things before I even encounter the things. I look forward to supper in a way that has nothing to do with the food. And sitting here with you tonight, working on this together, feels more like my actual life than anything I have done in years." He paused. "I am aware that you are employed here and that I am your employer, and I am aware that you have recently experienced a situation in which a man in a position of authority over you took advantage of that relationship in the worst possible way. I want to be very clear that I am not doing that. I am not telling you this because it benefits me. I am telling you because it is true, and because I have spent my whole life not saying true things when they are difficult to say, and I am tired of it." She sat very still. Outside the window, the Wyoming night pressed in with its cold. "You are not misreading the situation," she said. "No, no," she said. "You are reading it very accurately." He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight with the ranch documents between them and the snow outside the window. And it was one of those moments that does not make a sound but changes everything. They moved carefully after that. He was precise about this, and she appreciated the precision. He was conscious of the power imbalance inherent in their positions and worked actively to mitigate it, which manifested in small but significant ways. He made sure the other hands knew that her authority in the house was not contingent on his approval and did not require his validation. He was privately attentive and publicly professional, not because he was ashamed of his feelings, but because he understood that her reputation was more fragile than his and that the Wild West of 1883 was not generous with women whose characters could be questioned. He asked explicitly what pace she was comfortable with. She told him honestly that she needed time to trust something that felt good, because her experience had been that things that felt good had historically contained hidden motives that she had not detected early enough. He said he understood. He was patient in a way that cost him something, and she knew it, and it meant more to her than grand gestures would have. February brought a thaw, and then another freeze, and then something that the sky hinted might eventually become spring. The way Wyoming springs always arrived, as a rumor rather than a declaration. The legal challenge to the water rights moved through the Laramie courts with the deliberate pace of all frontier legal proceedings. But Elias Forster was quietly confident, and the alternative winter water sources had held through the hard months without the herd suffering significant losses. Voss came back in February. He was less pleasant this time. "I have heard about your legal action," he said, sitting across from Kade in the front room, his hat on his knee, his eyes flat. "I want you to understand that I have been operating in this territory for 20 years, and I have resources you do not. This challenge will be expensive and slow." "I have time and evidence," Kade said. "I would suggest those are adequate resources." "I also want you to understand," Voss said, and his gaze moved briefly, deliberately toward the kitchen door where Josephine was working, "that I have made inquiries about the people on your property. All of them." The room temperature dropped perceptibly. "What I have learned about your housekeeper," Voss continued, "is that she left Cheyenne under somewhat clouded circumstances. Something to do with a financial fraud, I believe." Kade said nothing. He was very still. "I would not want that information to become public knowledge unnecessarily," Voss said. "It would be an unpleasant situation for her, I imagine." "You are threatening a woman who has nothing to do with our business arrangement," Kade said. "I am simply observing that discretion can be mutual. If you withdraw your legal challenge and accept my original arrangement, I see no reason to take any interest in your staff's histories." Kade stood up from his chair. "Get off my property," he said. "Today. Now. And do not come back unless you are accompanied by your attorney and prepared to answer for the fraudulent water rights transfer in front of a judge." Voss stood, smoothed his coat, and placed his hat on his head with the unhurried composure of a man who believes he has planted a seed he expects to find growing on his next visit. He left without another word. Kade stood in the front room for a moment after the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he went to the kitchen. Josephine was at the sink, her back to the door, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she had heard. "I heard," she said before he could speak. "I am not going to withdraw the challenge. I know you are not, and he has no actual power over you. What happened in Cheyenne was not your fault, and you did nothing fraudulent. If he attempts to damage your reputation, we will address it." She turned around. There was something complicated in her face, something that was not quite fear and not quite relief and was somewhere in the difficult territory between them. "He knows where I am," she said. "Yes. If he tells Lawrence Holt where I am, does Holt have a legal claim on you?" Kade asked directly. "Can he compel you to return?" "No, but he is not a man who respects the limits of what he can legally compel." She looked at Kade steadily. "I want you to know that I never intended to bring this kind of trouble to your door." "You did not bring it," Kade said. "Voss brought it. And Holt, wherever he is a man who has already done the worst he can do to you, which was convince you that you were not worth more than he offered." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. "You are on my property and under my protection and in whatever the right word is for what is happening between us, and I am not frightened of either of those men. Are you clear on that?" She looked up at him. "The right word," she said, "is that I am in your heart, the same way you are in mine, and yes, I am clear on that." He kissed her then for the first time in the kitchen of his ranch house with the winter light coming through the window above the sink, and it was not dramatic or elaborate. It was exactly what it was, honest and tentative and very sure, all at once. March came in with the usual contest between winter and whatever season was slowly winning. The legal proceedings accelerated because Elias Forster had found additional evidence, specifically a witness in Laramie who had been present during the original water rights negotiation, and who was willing to testify that the instrument had been filed with a false date, making the transfer legally subsequent to several protections that predated it. Voss's position was weakening. Kade sent a letter to Josephine's former employer in Denver, the legitimate one from before the Cheyenne disaster, explaining the situation and asking for a character reference that could be used if Voss chose to pursue his threatened campaign of reputation damage. The Denver employer, a Mrs. Calloway, wrote back promptly with a letter of such thorough and warm recommendation that Josephine sat with it for a long time when Kade placed it in her hands, not quite able to speak. "How did you know to contact her?" she finally asked. "You mentioned her once in passing," he said. "Denver, before Cheyenne, you said she had been a fair employer. You remembered that from one mention weeks ago." "I remember everything you say," he said simply, and she looked at him with an expression that suggested he had just dismantled something she had been defending for a long time without realizing it. Lawrence Holt did not appear at the ranch. Whether Voss ever actually contacted him was never confirmed, but as the legal situation turned increasingly against Voss in March and April, his threats became less specific, and his visits ceased. The court ruled in Kade's favor in the first week of April, finding the water rights transfer fraudulent and restoring the original access protections to the Merritt property. Voss appealed as expected, but Forster assessed the appeal as unlikely to succeed, and the immediate threat to the herd's water access was removed. Kade told Josephine the news at supper on a Thursday evening, and the crew was present. And when she set down the serving dish and simply stood still for a moment with her eyes closed and something releasing in her face, the entire table understood they were witnessing something that was not about water rights. Walt Briggs looked very carefully at his plate. Clem apparently found something fascinating in the middle distance. Pete appeared to be counting the nails in the wall. Kade reached across the corner of the table and took her hand. In front of his foreman and his crew and everyone assembled at supper, he held her hand and let them all see it. She opened her eyes and looked at him and said, quietly but completely without concealment, "Thank you." April on the ranch was a season of restoration. The grass came back, the herd was healthy after a challenging winter, and the mood of the place lifted with the temperature. Josephine and Kade moved into something that felt, for the first time in years for both of them, like a life being built rather than a life being survived. He showed her the full extent of the ranch on horseback, on a Saturday when the weather was clear, and the mountains were still carrying snow on their peaks, but the lower elevations were green and soft. She was a competent rider, which he had suspected, and was confirmed. He showed her the far eastern section where the grass was richest, and the northern boundary where the disputed creek ran, clear and cold and entirely their right to use, and the rocky western pasture, where he had been meaning to build a new shelter for the horses and had never quite had the time. She asked him about his father as they rode, and he told her more than he had told anyone, about a man who had been formidably capable and emotionally remote, and had expressed love primarily through legacy, by building something worth inheriting, by teaching rather than declaring. He told her about the loneliness of growing up with a father who was present in every practical sense and absent in almost every other. "That is why you do what you do," she said. "What do I do? You build things. You manage things. You ensure that everything functions and that everyone on this property has what they need. It is the way you were taught to love people, by making sure their practical needs are met." He rode in silence for a moment. "That is uncomfortably accurate." "You are also capable of the other kind," she said. "You just needed someone who would not leave when you were slow to find the words." He looked at her, and the mountains were behind her and the green Wyoming spring was all around them, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he wanted to marry her. He did not say it yet. The timing was not right and he knew it. But the thought was there, complete and certain, and it changed the shape of what the future looked like. May arrived and brought with it a letter that changed everything. It was addressed to Josephine and it came from Cheyenne, and she read it at the kitchen table one morning before Kade was up, and she was still sitting with it in her hands when he came in for coffee. He saw her face and sat down across from her without getting the coffee. "What is it?" She set the letter on the table between them. It was from an attorney in Cheyenne named Prout, representing Lawrence Holt. The substance of it was this: Holt had been formally charged with fraud in Denver and was facing serious legal consequences. His attorneys had constructed a defense strategy that involved, in part, attributing significant portions of the fraudulent financial management to a woman named Josephine Zahra, who had served as his secretary and bookkeeper, and who had, they contended, been the primary operator of the accounts in question. A warrant had been issued in Colorado for her appearance as a person of interest in the fraud investigation. Holt was trying to frame her. Or rather, he had always intended to frame her, and the machinery for doing so had now been formally set in motion. Kade read the letter twice. When he put it down, his jaw was set in a way she had not seen since the worst of the Voss confrontations. "This is fabricated," he said. "Yes, but it is also official, and the difference between those two things may take a long time and a great deal of money to establish. We will establish it. Forster can handle this, Kade." She looked at him very directly. "The warrant is in Colorado. I cannot go to Cheyenne or Denver. If I cross into Colorado, I could be detained before Forster has had time to." "You are not going to Colorado," he said. "You are staying here. There may be extradition. Then Forster will argue against it. He is very good." She was quiet for a moment. "You understand that this is going to be expensive and complicated, and that I am bringing this to your door directly now, not through Voss's interference, but through my own history." He looked at her as though she had said something that did not quite make sense to him. "You did not create this," he said. "Holt created this. And I am going to help you fight it because it is right to do so, and because you are the most important person in my life, and those two reasons together are more than sufficient." She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I am afraid." "I know," he said. "Tell me what you are afraid of specifically." "I am afraid that this will never end, that he will always have some instrument to reach me with, that no matter how far I go or how carefully I construct a life, there will always be a letter like this one." He reached across the table and held both her hands in both of his. "We are going to end it," he said. "Not run from it. End it. I have resources and I have a good attorney and I have a witness in Denver who has already vouched for your character. We are going to fight this in the courts, and we are going to win it." She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she had spent enough time watching him do exactly what he said he would do, that his word had become a kind of reliable infrastructure in her life. Forster was engaged immediately. He reviewed the warrant and communicated with his counterpart in Denver, a process that took 3 weeks and involved an extraordinary amount of correspondence. What emerged from that process was a picture of Holt's fraud that was actually substantially clearer than the authorities in Denver had previously had, because Josephine, with Forster's guidance, was able to provide a detailed account of the accounting practices and documentation she had worked with, demonstrating both the fraudulent nature of the accounts and the specific absence of her own authorization or knowledge of the fraudulent portions. During those weeks, the ranch continued. The work did not pause for anyone's legal crisis, which was both the burden and the grace of ranch life, that the cattle needed feeding, and the accounts needed keeping, and the supper needed cooking regardless of what was being negotiated in distant courtrooms. Josephine worked and Kade worked, and they found each other at the end of each day, and the continuity of that, the simple repeated fact of coming home to the same person, was its own kind of argument against despair. In the middle of June, two things happened within 3 days of each other. The first was that Elias Forster sent word that Denver's case against Lawrence Holt had been substantially strengthened by Josephine's account, and the corroborating records she had been able to provide, and that the warrant against her had been formally withdrawn, and that Holt's own attorneys had apparently abandoned the strategy of attributing blame to her once it became clear that her documentation would actively reinforce the prosecution's case against their client. The second was that Kade asked her to marry him. He did not do it grandly, which she might have expected, or practically, which she also might have expected. He did it on a Sunday evening in early summer when they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the light change over the mountains the way Wyoming light does in June, slowly and with extraordinary color, and he turned to her and said, "I want to spend my life with you. Not because I need someone to run the household or manage the books, or because I am lonely, though all of those things have been true. Because you have made me understand what I was missing, which was someone to be honest with. I want to be honest with you for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The light was gold and the mountains were purple behind it, and everything was very quiet. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." The news spread through the ranch crew the following morning with the speed that only news of this particular category achieves, and the reception ranged from Clem's genuine and slightly emotional congratulations to Pete's enthusiastic handshake to Walt's gruff but clearly sincere, "Well, good. About time somebody made him human." They were married in August of 1883 at the Laramie Church, a simple ceremony attended by the ranch crew, Elias Forster and his wife, Mrs. Calloway from Denver, who came specifically for the occasion, and embraced Josephine for a long time at the reception, and a small number of the town's residents who had come to know Kade Merritt over the years, and were variously surprised and privately delighted to see him standing at the altar looking like a man who has just discovered something he had not known was possible. Josephine wore a dress of deep blue wool, because it was August in Wyoming and still cool enough in the evenings for wool, and she carried the wildflowers that Clem had gathered from the mountain meadow that morning and brought to her door wrapped in a bandana, which made her cry a little in the privacy of her room before the ceremony in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. The autumn of 1883 settled into a ranch rhythm that was different from the previous years. Not dramatically different in its practical structure, but different in the interior quality of it. The way a house changes when it stops being just a functional space and becomes someone's home. Josephine was no longer the hired housekeeper. She was the co-owner of the ranch in every way that mattered. Not yet, indeed, which Kade rectified the following spring by formally placing her name beside his on-the-land title, but in practice and in the daily reality of the decisions made and the work shared. She took over the financial management of the ranch completely, which freed Kade to focus on the operational decisions that were his particular strength. Under her organization, the supply costs decreased 14% within the first year, not through deprivation but through better planning and more strategic purchasing. She identified a relationship with a Cheyenne cattle buyer that got them better prices for their spring sales than they had been getting from the local buyer, who had been operating with comfortably little competition. Kade watched her work with an admiration that he expressed in the way he had learned to express such things, through action and through presence. He built her a proper study off the bedroom, because the desk in the front room was not adequate for the scope of what she was managing, and he built it himself over 2 weeks in November while she was busy inside. And when he showed it to her, she stood in the doorway of it looking at the shelves and the window that faced the morning light and the proper surface for the account books and said, "You built this for me." "You needed the space," he said. "You built it with your own hands." "I had Clem help with the framing," he admitted. She put her arms around his waist and her face against his chest, and he held her there in the doorway of the study he had built for her. And the ranch was quiet around them with the Wyoming November outside, and the warmth of the house inside, and everything was, for a stretch of days that he wanted to hold very carefully, completely right. It was December, when the complicated thing that would eventually lead to the train platform began to move. He was not aware of it at first. It came in the form of a letter from his cousin in Nebraska, a man named Robert Merritt, whom Kade had not been in regular communication with for several years. The letter was friendly in tone, and contained what appeared to be straightforward news about the family. But embedded in it was a question about the ranch's financial situation that was specific enough to be more than casual. Robert asked whether Kade had considered investing in the Nebraska land venture that several ranching families in the territory were apparently participating in, describing it in terms that were enthusiastic and somewhat imprecise. Kade might have dismissed it, but Robert came in person in January, and Robert in person was considerably more charming and compelling than Robert on paper. He was 32, personable, with the particular energy of a man who has found something he believes in wholeheartedly and cannot stop talking about. The venture was a consortium of ranching families pooling capital to purchase a large tract of Nebraska grassland that was expected to open to private sale the following year. The argument being that the price would be significantly lower for a bulk purchase than for individual parcels. Josephine sat through the supper during which Robert presented this and said very little and watched him carefully. Afterward, when Robert had retired to the guest room, she sat with Kade at the kitchen table and said, "What do you actually know about the land title process for the Nebraska parcel?" "What Robert described," Kade said. "What Robert described was very general. He did not cite specific figures, he did not name the other consortium members, and when you asked about the timeline, his answer changed the terms without appearing to." Kade was quiet. "He is family," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know. I also know that the people who have cost me the most in my life were people I trusted because of relationship rather than evidence." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I am not saying he is lying. I am saying we should find out more before committing anything." He wrote to Elias Forster. The response came in 3 weeks, and it was not reassuring. The Nebraska land venture existed, but the legal status of the parcels was contested, and the consortium that Robert was promoting included several names that Forster recognized from previous land speculation schemes that had left investors holding claims on land that could not be legally transferred. Robert himself appeared to be a sincere enthusiast who had been persuaded rather than a deliberate fraudster. But the venture itself was unsound, Kade told Robert. The conversation was difficult, because Robert had already invested his own savings and was humiliated by the revelation that he had been promoting something problematic. And his initial response was defensive, and then hurt. And he left the ranch in February with a distance between them that would take time to repair, but which did not, Kade believed, require permanent rupture. What happened next was that Robert, in the complicated emotional aftermath of his own embarrassment, talked to a man in Laramie about the refusal of the Merritt Ranch to invest. That man happened to be acquainted with Darnell Voss. And Voss, whose appeal had been declined, and whose property now shared a border with a ranch that had beaten him legally twice, decided that this was an opportunity to do something that was not quite legal but was difficult to prevent. Voss began a campaign. It was subtle and slow, the kind of damage that is almost impossible to address directly because it never quite constitutes a formal accusation. He spoke to people in Laramie about the management of the Merritt Ranch and the new woman who was running its finances. He suggested, in the careful language of implication rather than statement, that there were questions about her history. He repeated the Cheyenne story in the version that omitted the warrant's withdrawal and the vindication. He mentioned the forged reference letter, which he had apparently known about from the beginning and had held in reserve. By March, Josephine became aware that something had changed in Laramie. It was subtle at first, a conversation that ended a little too quickly. A shopkeeper who was courteous but not quite warm in the way she had been before. A woman at the general store who moved away from the counter when Josephine approached with a calculation that did not appear to be accidental. She tracked it back to Voss through a conversation with Mrs. Forster, who told her in the frank manner of a woman who considered euphemism a waste of time that Voss had been talking about her in the feed store and at the Stockmen's Association meeting, and that the talk was specific enough to have originated from someone with detailed information. She told Kade. His response was immediate, and it was the wrong one. He went to Laramie the following morning, and he found Darnell Voss at the Stockmen's Association office, and he told him, in front of witnesses, that if Voss continued to defame his wife, Kade would pursue legal action for slander, and he would pursue it personally and with every resource at his disposal. Voss said, pleasantly, in front of those same witnesses, that he was simply sharing factual information about a woman who had arrived at the Merritt Ranch with a fraudulent reference letter and a history of financial entanglement in Cheyenne, and that if Mr. Merritt chose to be sensitive about the facts of his wife's past, he could not help that. And then Voss said, with the timing of a man who has been waiting for this exact moment, I do wonder sometimes whether Mr. Merritt himself was aware of her history when he hired her, or whether she deceived him as thoroughly as she apparently deceived everyone else. And Kade, standing in the Stockmen's Association office with witnesses all around him, and the accumulated pressure of months of legal battle and months of protecting and months of loving someone so much that the threat to her felt like a physical attack, said something he would spend months trying to undo. She is my employee, he said, in a voice that was flat and controlled and designed to deny Voss the satisfaction of having touched anything important. She manages my household. I do not take a personal interest in her history beyond what affects her work, and her work is satisfactory. She is nothing more than a hired woman doing a hired job. He said it because he thought it would protect her. He thought if he denied the personal connection, Voss's campaign against her reputation would lose its momentum, would cease to be interesting if it could not touch him. He thought he was being strategic. He did not think about who else was in that room. He did not think about the fact that Walt Briggs had come to Laramie that day for supplies. He did not think about the fact that Walt, who was professionally courteous and personally reserved, and who had tremendous respect for Josephine Zahra Merritt, would hear exactly what his employer had said, and would ride back to the ranch ahead of Kade and would, in the way of a man who believes in directness, tell her what had been said. He did not think about any of that. He thought he was protecting her. He was destroying them. She was at the kitchen table when he came home. The account books were open in front of her, but she was not looking at them. She was looking at the window. He knew the moment he walked in and saw her face that Walt had come back first. "You heard what I said," he said. Word for word as Walt heard it, she said. Her voice was very calm. "I was trying to." "I know what you were trying to do," she said. "And I want you to think about whether the thing you were trying to do was actually for me, or whether it was for yourself." She looked at him steadily. "Because standing in a room full of men, and saying that the woman you married is nothing more than hired help, that she is nothing to you beyond her usefulness, that is not protection. That is the loudest possible statement that you are ashamed of me. That you would rather they believe she means nothing than have them believe she means everything. That is not what I intended." "I know what you intended," she said again. "And I am telling you that intentions are not the same thing as impacts, and that what you did today was stand in front of my enemies and agree with them." He stood across the kitchen from her with everything he wanted to say pressing up against the inadequacy of words. "Josephine, I need you to leave me alone tonight," she said. "I need to think." He left her alone. He spent the night in the barn, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but because she had asked him for space and he intended to respect that, and because he needed to sit with what he had done without the buffer of her presence letting him off the hook too easily. He did not sleep. He sat in the straw with the horses breathing around him, and he thought about what she had said, about the difference between intended protection and actual harm, about the way fear for someone you love can make you reach for the wrong tool with the confidence of someone reaching for the right one. He thought about his father, who had built legacy as a substitute for declaration, and he thought about how clearly he had inherited that instinct and how clearly she had seen through it from the beginning. He thought about the specific words he had used. Nothing more than a hired woman doing a hired job. He thought about her sitting at that table with her account books and her window, having heard that from the man who had sworn in a church to love her, and he felt a particular kind of shame that he recognized as the productive kind, the kind that does not spiral but instead points directly toward what needs to be repaired. In the morning he went inside. She was in the study, working at the account books with a focus that was clearly partially artificial. He stood in the doorway and said, "I should not have said what I said. I said it because I was frightened and I reached for the first weapon I could find that I thought would end the attack, and I did not stop to think about what that weapon would do to you. I was wrong and I am sorry." She put down her pen. She looked at him. "You told them I was nothing to you," she said, "in front of everyone. I told them something false in a room full of people who didn't deserve the truth," he said. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. Tell me what you need." She was quiet for a long time. "I need to know that when it matters, when it costs you something, you will not trade me away to save yourself the discomfort of being associated with my history." "I will not," he said. "You have to understand," she said, and her voice was lower and more honest now, the controlled surface giving way to something underneath it, "that I have spent years being the person that other people traded away when I became inconvenient. Lawrence Holt. The families in Denver who believed his version. The friends in Cheyenne who distanced themselves when the trouble started. I have been erased by people who claim to care for me more times than I can easily count. And I cannot do that again. I cannot be erased by you." He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands. "You are the most important thing in my life," he said. "Everything I have built here is better because you are in it. I will spend the rest of my life saying that publicly and privately and to anyone who needs to hear it. I made a terrible mistake yesterday, and I am asking you to believe that I know it and that I will not make it again." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze. "I believe you," she said, "but something broke a little bit and we both need to know that." "Yes," he said, "I know." They spent the following weeks in the careful, deliberate work of repairing it, which was not dramatic, but was thorough. He was more intentional about how he spoke of her in public, which manifested almost immediately in a conversation with the Laramie banker that Josephine heard about through Mrs. Forster, in which Kade had introduced her formally as his wife and the co-manager of the ranch's financial operations, had cited two specific decisions she had made that had materially improved the ranch's position, and had done so with the casual confidence of a man stating facts he considers too obvious to require elaboration. Voss's campaign gradually lost momentum, partly because Kade was no longer unwittingly supporting it, and partly because Mrs. Forster was a more effective counter-propagandist than Voss had anticipated. But something had shifted in Josephine in a way that did not fully undo, even as the immediate injury healed. It was not distrust exactly. It was something more like the reactivation of a survival instinct that had learned, long before she came to Wyoming, that when someone showed you their capacity to erase you, you were wise to consider your contingencies. She did not consciously plan to leave. But she began, in the quieter parts of her mind, to think about what it would mean to be able to leave if she needed to. She wrote to Mrs. Calloway in Denver. She quietly confirmed the current status of the legal situation with Forster, ensuring there was no remaining instrument that would complicate travel. She put aside a small amount of cash from the household accounts, which was not deceptive. It was the household's money and she was the household's manager, but the intention behind it was a kind of insurance that she acknowledged to herself was not a sign of complete faith. Kade did not notice. He was occupied with the spring work, and with the continuing effort to repair their relationship, and with a new problem that had emerged on the western pasture, a fence line dispute with a small new neighboring property that required careful management. He was attentive and loving and working hard to demonstrate both, and he did not see the slight distance that had re-established itself in the deepest interior of his wife's regard. It was in May, 14 months after Josephine had arrived at the Merritt Ranch gate with her carpetbag and her forged letter, that the final complication arrived. It came from Robert, who was trying to repair his own relationship with Kade, and who came to the ranch in the first week of May with a very different energy than his January visit. He was subdued and apologetic and genuinely distressed, and in the course of a long evening conversation, he revealed that the Nebraska land venture had completely collapsed, and that several of the families involved had lost significant portions of their savings, and that the primary organizer of the venture was now known to be a man who had operated similar schemes in Kansas and Missouri under slightly different names. He also revealed, incidentally, that one of the families most severely affected was a ranching family named the Holloways, who had a daughter, Clara Holloway, who had been engaged to Robert before the financial disaster, and who had broken the engagement when the loss of her family's savings made the situation untenable, and who was now in Laramie with her family looking for work. Kade arranged for Clara Holloway to be given a position with the Forsters, who needed household help. Robert was grateful. Clara Holloway, who was 24 and had honest eyes and a practical intelligence that Josephine recognized and felt a kinship with on first meeting, was quietly grateful too. None of that was the complication. The complication was that Robert, in his gratitude and his still guilty conscience about the ranch and about Josephine, told Kade something he had learned in the course of the Nebraska collapse. He had been in contact, at various points, with men who moved in the same speculative circles as Lawrence Holt. And through those contacts, he had learned that Lawrence Holt, having been convicted of fraud in Denver and sentenced to 3 years in the Colorado Territorial Prison, had in the weeks before his imprisonment transferred his assets through a series of legal instruments to a trust managed by an associate, and that one of those instruments had been a claim of breach of contract against Josephine Zahra, formerly of Cheyenne, currently residing in the Wyoming Territory. The claim was almost certainly unenforceable. Forster said so in the letter he sent 3 days after Kade wrote to him in some urgency. It was a last act of spite by a man going to prison, an attempt to create as much legal turbulence in her wake as possible before the cell door closed. But it was an official file document, and until Forster could have it formally dismissed, it existed. And it was the kind of document that could be used to complicate her position in ways that might not be resolved quickly. Josephine read Forster's letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about the March conversation at the Stockmen's Association. She thought about Kade saying she was nothing. She thought about it the way a person thinks about something that has been treated and is healing but is still tender. She thought about how that moment had reactivated something in her that she had spent years trying to quiet. She made a decision that was wrong, and she made it for reasons that were entirely understandable, and she began to pack. She did not tell Kade what she was doing. She told herself she needed time to think, and that she could think better with some distance. She told herself she was going to Laramie to consult with Forster directly. Both of those things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth. The whole truth was that she was frightened. She was frightened that this man whom she loved with a depth that continued to surprise her had shown her, once, that when the pressure was high enough and the audience wrong enough, he could erase her. And another legal threat was arriving just as she had begun to trust that the previous ones were behind her. And the combination of those two things, love and fear and history, and the particular vulnerability of having been hurt in exactly this way by exactly this category of man before, was producing a pressure in her chest that she did not know what to do with except put distance between herself and it. She put together her carpet bag. She wrote a note. The note was careful, and it was not a goodbye, she told herself. It was an explanation. She was going to Laramie to see Forster, and she needed some time, and she would contact him when she knew what she needed. She left it on the kitchen table. She went to the barn and saddled her horse and rode to Laramie. At the Laramie station, she learned that there was a westbound train at 2 in the afternoon that continued to Colorado and from there to California. She did not have a plan beyond Colorado. She had Mrs. Calloway's address in Denver. She thought she might go there first and collect herself, and decide what she actually wanted. She bought a ticket. She stood at the platform with her carpetbag in her hand, and the train ahead of her and something in her chest that was not quite certainty, and was doing its best to feel like it. That was where Clem found her. Clem, who had come to town for supplies and had passed by the house on his way out and had read the note on the kitchen table, had not been certain what to do. He was 44 years old and had worked the ranch for 9 years, and had his own views about the world and about people. And his view was that what was on that table was a woman who was leaving not because she wanted to but because she was scared, and that his employer needed to know about it. He had ridden fast to the western pasture, where Kade was working on the fence dispute, and he had handed him the note without a word. Kade had read it in 45 seconds. He had ridden for the station without stopping. He arrived at the platform as the first boarding call went out. He saw her on the steps of the train car. He called her name. She looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and every word he had ever failed to say, and every moment he had been too proud to be honest, and every time he had chosen armor over honesty rose up in him like a tide, and something gave way. He was on his knees in the mud before he had made a conscious decision to kneel. His hat was in his hands and the rain was on his head, and the Wyoming mud was cold and wet through his denims, and none of it registered as relevant information. "Josephine," he said, "I lied. I told them you were nothing. I told myself it was strategy and it was armor and I was protecting you. I was doing what I have always done, which is protect myself from having to be vulnerable in public, and I used you to do it. I have spent my whole life building things instead of saying things, and I am telling you now, with half of Laramie watching, that you are everything to me. You are the only person I have ever been fully honest with. You are the person I built a study for with my own hands because you needed the space, and I needed you to have it. You are the person I go to sleep thinking about and wake up grateful for. You changed the ranch and you changed me, and I know I hurt you, and I know you are frightened and I understand why, but please do not get on that train." The second boarding call shrieked above them. She stood on the step and looked down at this man who had never knelt before anyone, and who was kneeling in the mud of the Laramie station platform in the rain with his hat in his hands. And she felt everything in her that had been braced and defended and positioned for retreat shift with a slow, inexorable weight. She thought about Lawrence Holt, who had said beautiful things and done ugly ones. She thought about Kade Merritt, who had done beautiful things and said one ugly one, and who was currently saying the most vulnerable true thing she had ever heard from a man's mouth, in public, in the mud, in the rain. She thought about the study with the morning light. She thought about the fence he had fixed in 30 minutes. She thought about the coffee held in both hands. She thought about every small daily language of love that he had spoken in the only vocabulary he had known. And then she thought about this new vocabulary, acquired apparently in the time it took to ride from the western pasture to the Laramie station. She stepped down from the train. She stepped down from the train onto the muddy platform, and she stood in front of him, and she took his face in both her hands, and she said, "Stand up." He stood up. He was covered in mud from the knees down, and the rain was in his hair, and his eyes were the most unguarded she had ever seen them. "I was not leaving you," she said. "I want you to know that. I was leaving the fear, and I did not know how to separate those two things, so I was taking both of them with me on a train." "I know," he said. "I should have seen that you were frightened. I should have seen it and stayed closer instead of going to work. I should have told you instead of writing a note and saddling a horse. We are both going to have to get better at telling each other things," he said. "Yes," she said, "we are." He put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood on the muddy Laramie platform in the rain with the train behind her, and the entire accumulated audience of the station around them, and neither of them moved for a long time. A man near the ticket window began, with visible effort, to look at something else. 3 women near the entrance to the station exchanged glances that conveyed, collectively, an entire novel's worth of reaction. The station master, a practical man named Higgins who had seen a great deal in 20 years of running the Laramie station, quietly told the engineer that they would hold departure for 5 minutes, which was well within his authority and which he considered an entirely reasonable expenditure. They went home. They sat together in the kitchen, and they talked for 3 hours, not efficiently and not always coherently, but thoroughly, about Lawrence Holt and the Cheyenne disaster, and the forged letter, and the fear of being erased and the Stockmen's Association, and what he had said and why and what it had done to her, and what it had done to him when he understood it. They talked about the things they had both been carrying, and had been managing alone instead of together, which was the oldest and most persistent mistake that two proud, self-reliant people could make in a marriage. Kade said, more than once in various formulations, that he was sorry. Josephine heard him each time, and each time it landed differently as they cleared more of the accumulated debris away and found the thing underneath it, which was a marriage that was not broken but had been badly strained by two people who had both learned that showing vulnerability had costs and had both been slow to unlearn it. She said at some point in the third hour, "I did not want to leave. I want you to know that. I have not wanted anything to work as much as I have wanted this." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Because you stopped," he said simply. "You were on the step and you had the ticket in your hand and you stopped." She looked at him. "You stopped me. You stopped," he said again. "I was in the mud asking you, but you stopped." She thought about that and found it true. They engaged Forster to address the Holt claim aggressively, which Forster did with considerable enthusiasm, filing for formal dismissal with supporting documentation that included Holt's conviction record, the previously withdrawn Colorado warrant, and 2 affidavits from individuals in Denver who had been present during the financial operations and could attest to Josephine's non-involvement. The claim was dismissed in October of that year without reaching a hearing. Lawrence Holt served his full sentence and was released into conditions of impoverishment and obscurity that, while Josephine took no pleasure in another person's suffering, did represent the natural conclusion of the trajectory he had chosen. Darnell Voss's appeal was finally, definitively, denied in the autumn of 1883. He sold his property the following year and moved east, which removed the most persistent external threat to the Merritt ranch's stability with a completeness that neither of them had dared to expect so soon. Robert Merritt came back to the ranch for Christmas of 1883. He came with a careful humility that was genuine, and with Clara Holloway on his arm, which was unexpected, and which delighted Josephine in a way that she expressed primarily by feeding them an extraordinary supper, and asking Clara approximately 400 questions about her interests and background. Robert and Kade rebuilt their relationship through the winter, slowly and with the specific kind of honesty that can sometimes emerge from a mutual humiliation, which is honest and real and harder to destroy than easy kinship. The ranch's second year under Josephine's co-management ended with the best financial position it had held in 6 years, which Kade noted in the annual accounts review with a quiet satisfaction that she recognized as his highest register of enthusiasm. "You are pleased," she said. "I am pleased," he confirmed. "You might say so. I am saying so. You have been staring at those numbers for 3 minutes making no sound." "I am appreciating them," he said. He looked up from the accounts. "You did that. Most of that gain is your decisions." "Our decisions," she said. "I make them here." She tapped her temple. "And you make them happen out there." She gestured toward the window and the visible landscape of the ranch beyond it. "That is the division that works." He looked at her with the particular steadiness he had, the look she had come to understand as his most unguarded expression, which involved no specific feature but a quality of complete attention that she felt as something physical. "I love you," he said. It was getting easier for him. He had been practicing since the mud of the Laramie Station platform, and practice had made it progressively less like lifting something heavy and more like setting something down. "I love you," she said back, which had never been difficult for her once she had been certain enough to say it, and she had been certain enough for a long time now. The spring of 1884 brought two things of note. The first was the formal recording of Josephine's name on the Merritt Ranch deed, which Kade had prepared quietly, and which Forster witnessed with a satisfaction that suggested it was a correction he had been waiting to see made. The second was that Josephine discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Wednesday morning in March, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming in the window and the sounds of the ranch starting up outside. And she watched him process it with the internal calibration of a man receiving information that his mind is large enough to hold, but that his heart is still accommodating. He sat down at the table. "Are you certain?" he said. "Fairly certain," she said. "Dr. Haynes confirmed it yesterday." He looked at her and then at the table and then at her again. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is generally how it works." Something moved across his face that she had seen very rarely and only in moments of the highest consequence, something that was not the managed competence or the deliberate calm, but the actual interior life of him, unmediated. It was joy. It was pure and somewhat enormous, and he did not appear to know exactly what to do with it. "Come here," he said. She sat across from him, and he took her hands across the table and held them and looked at her steadily with that same unmanaged joy. "I am going to be better," he said. "I know I have been saying things like that for months and I have been trying, but this is different. I want whatever this child sees of me to be." He stopped. "Better than what you had," she said gently. He swallowed. "Yes, you are already better than what you had," she said. "You said I love you this morning before you were out of bed. You built me a study. You knelt in the mud." She squeezed his hands. "You have been better for a while. You just have to keep being it." The child was born in November of 1884. A boy, healthy and loud and possessed of Kade's gray eyes and Josephine's dark hair, which she found vastly amusing, and he found overwhelming in a way he had not anticipated. They named him Thomas, which had been Kade's father's middle name, a concession to legacy that felt right, and James as a second name, after Josephine's brother in Colorado, whom she had not spoken to in 3 years, and to whom she wrote the week of Thomas's birth with a letter that took 4 drafts and contained significantly more honesty than any of the previous 3. Her brother James wrote back. The correspondence that followed was tentative, and then warmer, and then, by the following spring, regular enough to suggest that the relationship could be rebuilt, which it was, over the next several years. Clem was Thomas's unofficial godfather from approximately the 3rd day of his life, a role he had not been formally assigned, but had assumed with such natural completeness that formalizing it would have been redundant. Pete, who had by now resolved his early sentimental attachment to Josephine into a genuine and uncomplicated respect, carved a cradle from pine wood that was the finest piece of woodworking anyone on the ranch had ever seen, and that became Thomas's first bed, and then, in subsequent years, the first bed of his siblings. Because there were siblings. Margaret was born in 1887, with Josephine's eyes and Kade's stubbornness, which manifested early, and with a commitment that suggested she was going to be an interesting person to know. She was followed in 1889 by another boy, Daniel, who had both of their coloring somehow, dark-eyed but fair-skinned, and who arrived into a household that had by then developed a competence with children that came from practice, and from the settled confidence of 2 people who had, through considerable difficulty, and one mud-soaked platform in Laramie, found their way to a life that was genuinely theirs. The Merritt Ranch continued to grow. By 1888 it had expanded to nearly 7,000 acres through 2 careful land purchases in adjacent areas, both of which Josephine had analyzed and approved before Kade committed. The crew had grown to 14 hands, the herd to over 200, and the financial operation of the ranch had become sufficiently complex that Josephine had brought on a young woman from Laramie named Anne to assist with the bookkeeping, which she supervised and mentored in a way that Anne, who had been working in a laundry and was significantly underutilized there, found genuinely transformative. The community standing of the Merritt Ranch, which had spent an unpleasant period subject to Voss's whisper campaign, had long since recovered and surpassed its previous position. Kade's reputation in Albany County had always been for competence and integrity. Josephine's reputation, once established on her own terms rather than through the distortions of others' malice, proved to be even better, because she had the combination of intelligence and directness and generosity that people tend to remember. She was on the organizing committee for the Laramie Library that opened in 1886. She corresponded with suffrage organizations in the East because the Wyoming Territory had granted women the right to vote in 1869, a fact she found both remarkable and appropriate. And she was interested in how the eastern states might be brought to similar positions, which was a long project but an important one. She helped Clara Holloway, who married Robert Merritt in 1885 and settled in Nebraska, but who returned to Wyoming for 2 months each year, develop a plan for managing the finances of their own small ranch that drew on the same principles she had applied at the Merritt. Kade watched all of this with an admiration that he now expressed with somewhat more fluency than he once had, partly because Josephine had been a patient and consistent teacher on the subject of saying things out loud, and partly because he had discovered that the things he said about her to other people came back to her through the normal channels of a community that paid attention, and that her face when she heard them was one of the better things he had ever seen. He told Elias Forster once, in the front room of the Forster house after a supper, that his wife was the most genuinely formidable person he had ever encountered. Forster had nodded without surprise, because Forster had formed the same view approximately 6 months into their professional relationship and had been wondering when Kade would arrive at it officially. Mrs. Forster, who was present and who had heard the statement, relayed it to Josephine in its exact original wording 3 days later, because she believed in accurate transmission of important information. Josephine was in the kitchen when she heard it. She stood very still for a moment and then laughed, a genuine laugh with a quality of being seen in it. "He said formidable," she said. "Word for word," Mrs. Forster confirmed. "Genuinely formidable." And then he looked extremely pleased with himself for having said it, the way he does when he is right about something. Josephine thought about the kitchen table in the early morning, 14 months after she had arrived with her carpet bag and her forged letter, when she had confessed the lie about the reference to a man who had responded by asking whether she could actually do the things it said she could do, and then had said they would not discuss it further. She thought about what it meant that they had built this from that, from a forged letter and a desperate woman, and a contained man who did not know how to be anything else and had slowly, persistently, lovingly learned. That evening she found Kade in the study, reviewing the accounts, and she stood in the doorway and said, "Elias Forster told you that I am formidable." He looked up. He was 41 years old now, with gray at his temples and the deep, weathered lines of a man who had spent 20 years in Wyoming sun. And he looked at her with the same complete, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was the most consistent truth of him. "He did not tell me," Kade said. "I told him." "I know," she said. "He told his wife. She told me." And she came into the study and sat on the edge of the desk. Outside the window, The Wyoming evening was settling into the particular quality of light that precedes the best sunsets, the kind that make the mountains look like something painted. Inside the study, the account books were open, and the lamp was warm, and Thomas could be heard in the next room engaged in some activity that involved a great deal of construction. "And I think," she said, "that you are the most honest person I have ever known." He looked at her. "I was not always." "You learned to be," she said. "You learned to be, and you kept practicing even when it cost you something, and now you are." She touched his face. "That is better than never having had to learn." He turned his face into her hand for a moment, and she felt the weight of him, not the burden, but the substance, the real mass of a real person who had chosen to be here, fully here in this room and this life with her. Thomas's voice rose suddenly from the next room with a question about supper, and Margaret's voice joined it approximately half a second later with a different and competing request. And the spell of the quiet moment was not broken so much as incorporated into the larger, louder, more complicated spell of the life they were living. Josephine called back to Thomas that supper would be on the table in 30 minutes, and that whatever he was building, he was to make sure it was still standing when she came to look at it. She slid off the edge of the desk and smoothed her skirt and went to the kitchen. Kade sat for a moment longer in the lamplight. He looked at the account books, which were full of numbers that represented 14 years of work and risk and decision, and the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept that a thing cannot be built. He looked at the window, where the mountains were now doing the thing he had never entirely stopped finding extraordinary, burning red and gold against the cooling sky. He thought about a Tuesday in October of 1882, when a woman with a carpetbag had arrived at his gate and waited without fidgeting and watched his horses with the attention of someone who understood them. He thought about every step between that Tuesday and this evening. The forged letter and the honest kitchen conversation, the shared desk at midnight with the ranch documents, the first snow and the lamp left on, and the small daily languages accumulating into something permanent. Voss and Holt and Robert and the mud and the platform and the rain. He thought about the train she had not boarded. He got up from the desk and went to the kitchen, where supper was being made and his children were variously helpful and unhelpful. And the warmth of the stove was the center of a room that was the center of a house that was the center of a life that was, by any reasonable accounting, the best thing he had ever built. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Josephine work for a moment, and she looked up and saw him and said, "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to be useful?" He came into the kitchen and was useful. Thomas grew up to be thoughtful and methodical and very good with horses, which surprised no one. Margaret grew up to be formidable, which surprised no one either. Daniel grew up to be the most expressive of the three, the one who said what he meant directly and immediately, and who could not seem to understand why everyone else found this difficult, which Josephine suspected was a gift. The ranch outlasted most of what had threatened it. Voss's operation dissolved in 1886. The legal ghosts of Lawrence Holt's fraud were formally extinguished in 1889, when the trust holding his residual claim was liquidated in the course of proceedings against his associate. Robert and Clara Merritt's Nebraska ranch became modestly successful, and a source of genuine family connection that included 2 children of their own and regular visits in both directions. Elias Forster retired in 1890, and his practice was taken over by a young attorney from Cheyenne named Harrison, who had Forster's precision without Forster's reluctance to move quickly, and who Josephine found immediately effective. Clem, who had carved a place in the family that went well beyond employment, remained on the ranch until a horse accident in 1891 damaged his hip enough to require reduced duties, after which he occupied a permanent place in the household in a capacity that resisted formal description, but that everyone understood implicitly. He was at the Merritt table for every Christmas for the next 11 years. In 1892, Kade and Josephine Merritt rode the full length of their property together, the same way they had once ridden it in the spring of 1883, when everything was still tentative and new, and the shape of the future was not yet clear. They rode it on a September morning when the aspen trees were beginning to turn, and the mountains had the first whisper of autumn snow on their peaks, and the grass was full from a good summer's rain. Kade showed her the new shelter on the western pasture that had been finished in August, the one he had been meaning to build since the first spring she was there. He showed her the far eastern fence line that Thomas had rebuilt over the summer under Kade's supervision, with a care and precision that suggested he had inherited something useful. He showed her the creek, running clear and cold and entirely theirs. She showed him nothing because she had been there for all of it, but she looked at everything as though seeing it simultaneously as what it was now and what it had been, and what it meant that both of those things existed in the same landscape. "You remember what you were afraid of?" she asked, somewhere near the middle of the property, with the mountains ahead and the ranch behind and the sky enormous and blue above them. "Everything," he said, without pretending not to understand the question. "I was afraid of showing the size of what I felt because it seemed like too much to put in front of someone, too much to risk. And now I think the risk is the wrong thing to be measuring," he said. "The thing that matters is whether it is true." He looked at her. "What were you afraid of?" She thought about it honestly. "That the good things would be taken away," she said. "That every time something worked, there was a mechanism underneath it that would eventually flip. That I was not allowed to have the life I wanted because every time I had gotten close to it, someone had appeared with an instrument to remove it. And now," she looked around at the property, at the mountains, at the sky. "Now I think," she said slowly, "that the mechanism I was afraid of was not other people. Other people were just the vehicle for it. The mechanism was that I kept looking for the exit before I had given anything time to be real." She looked at him. "You were the first thing I stopped looking for the exit from. You were on the train steps," he pointed out. "I was on the train steps," she agreed, "and then I stepped down." "I was in the mud," he said. "You were in the mud," she agreed, "which is where the story gets interesting." He laughed, which was a sound she never entirely got used to, because it was too rare and too genuine. And every time she heard it, she was aware of having been the cause of something good. They rode back to the ranch in the September morning, through the grass and the aspens, under the enormous Wyoming sky, toward the house and the children and the life that was entirely, completely, unreservedly theirs. The train had gone west without her. The mud had dried and been forgotten. The legal instruments had been dismissed, and the enemies had moved on, and the fears had been, not entirely erased because nothing is entirely erased, but accommodated, understood, placed in their proper context as the history of two people who had been shaped by difficult things and had found, against various odds, that the shapes they had been given were complementary. On the Merritt Ranch in Albany County, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1892, supper was on the table at 6 o'clock. Thomas set the plates, because that had been his job since he was old enough to reach the shelf. Margaret, who was 5 and very clear on her own opinions, chose where everyone sat with an authority that no one with any sense attempted to override. Daniel, who was 3, was primarily interested in the bread, and made this interest known with enthusiasm. Kade came in from checking the evening pasture and washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table and looked at the people around it. The children and Clem in his customary corner seat and his wife at the head of it, serving supper with the focused efficiency of someone who had cooked for 8 men and found 3 children comparatively manageable. Josephine looked up and found him watching her and said, "Are you going to say grace or are you going to stare?" "I am going to say grace," he said. He said grace. He thanked whatever God presided over working ranches and stubborn people, and rainy train platforms for the food and the land and the year and the company. He said it simply and without elaboration, because that was his style, and when he was done, Margaret said a decisive amen and reached for the bread before Daniel got there first. Supper was noisy and warm, and full of the particular conversations of a household that has enough going on to keep everyone occupied, and enough security to let the noise be comfortable rather than anxious. Afterward, when the children were in bed and Clem had gone to his room, and the house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet after the daily machinery of living has run its full course, Kade and Josephine sat together on the porch in the cool September dark. The mountains were dark shapes against the lighter dark of the sky. The creek ran somewhere beyond hearing. The ranch breathed around them in the quiet, regular rhythms of an established and living thing. She took his hand. He held it. Neither of them spoke for a while, and the silence was the best kind, the kind that contains everything and requires nothing. "Tomorrow," she said eventually, "I need to go over the spring purchasing plan with you." Anne found a better source for fencing materials in Cheyenne, and I want your view on the transportation cost. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "And Thomas needs a new saddle. He has outgrown the one Clem fitted him with last year." "I know. I have been looking at what Johnson's carries. And the eastern pasture soil looked thin this season. I want to talk to someone about rotation." "Agreed." She was quiet for a moment. "I love you," she said, not as a conclusion to the list, but as a separate thing, its own sentence. "I love you," he said back. "More than is reasonable, probably." "Much more," she agreed. "I noticed early on." How early she considered it. "The firewood," she said. "When Clem started leaving firewood by the kitchen door, I knew it was not his idea." He was quiet. "That was October," he said. "I had known you 5 weeks." "Yes," she said. "That is what I mean." He brought her hand up and held it against his chest for a moment, not dramatically, just placing it there over the heartbeat, which said everything that the words were approaching from the side. The night was deep and clear, the way Wyoming nights are in September, full of stars and silence and the ancient indifference of mountains that have been there far longer than any of this and will be there long after. In that indifference, there was something clarifying, something that made the particular and specific and irreplaceable nature of what happened between 2 people on a small piece of earth feel more rather than less significant. A proud man had knelt in the mud and begged her not to board that train. A woman who had learned to love the exit had stepped back down onto the platform. Everything that mattered had followed from those 2 things, from the willingness to be seen and the willingness to stay, from the mud and the rain, and the choice made in 3 seconds on the steps of a westbound train in Laramie, Wyoming, in the spring of 1884. The ranch was quiet. The mountains were dark. The children were asleep inside and the accounts were balanced, and the deed had both their names on it. And the future was not threatened by anything that could not be addressed by 2 people who trusted each other completely, which was, in the end, the only instrument either of them had ever really needed.